Hello, this is Gene Prochnow, and I would like to share some of my capstone research with you in advance of our residency week next month. My subject is Major General Charles Lee of the Continental Army and whether he was a patriot or a traitor. General Lee made major contributions during his life, but he died with a cloud over his head before the revolution was finished. And then later on, historians have found some very disturbing documents that further ruined his reputation. However, he's been vilified by historians, but today I want to take a look more dispassionate view of his life and contributions. Um, when the revolution started, he was a very highly respected officer. In 1775. In fact, he was one of the most accomplished soldiers that joined the Continental Army. He was a lieutenant colonel, retired lieutenant colonel in the British Army. He has a very enlightened, what were they called, Whiggish political views. He emigrated to the United States because he wanted to be free. Notably, he is one of the most respected intellectual generals that we had in the Revolution. He wrote pamphlets. They didn't rival in Thomas Paine for their clarity, but in terms of passion and content, they did. During the early part of the Revolution, he was the go-to fix-it general for the Continental Army. When the Continental Army wanted to invade Canada, they assigned him to that task. Then all of a sudden they decided that he was more needed in the South. He went down south and helped repulse the British first invasion in the South successfully. Then they ordered him back to New York. They ordered him to help out Washington after the disastrous campaign that Washington led around New York. So the early part of the war, he was viewed as a very competent officer. However, during this last campaign, while crossing the state of New Jersey with his army, he made the disastrous decision of sleeping outside the confines of his camp, his army's camp. He stayed at an inn in Basking Ridge, New Jersey, and a local loyalist tipped off a British patrol that he was sleeping there with a very few guards. And so a troop of dragoons under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Harcourt made haste and rode about 20 miles to capture Lee. And Harcourt sent ahead a more famous cornet, Bonostrait Tarleton, who became very famous down south as Bloody Ban. And he captured Lee. And in fact, the British thought that when they captured Lee, they won the revolution. Much to their dismay, that didn't happen. And when he was captured, he was held in close confinement as a traitor. During that close confinement, Lee penned a plan that he gave to the British commander William Howe for ending the war. And the plan's on the right side. What happened is on the left side of this chart. But the first part of Lee's plan was to maintain bases in New York and Rhode Island, but then send a group to capture Philadelphia, and then also establish these small posts around the Central Atlantic. Lee regarded the Central Atlantic as the key to the nation, not cutting off New England from the rest of the colonies. And he said, if you do that and you declare for pardons, the German speakers will lead your return. Now, his plan was not disclosed to anybody publicly other than the British at this point in time. Now, what happened, we know that the red lines here on the chart were coming down from the north, where General Burgoyne invading the Champlain Valley. And we know that William Howe took the sea journey to Philadelphia, which are the dotted red lines, and he was not in a position to help Burgoyne. When Burgoyne got in trouble, the small New York garrison sent a expeditionary force under Sir Henry Clinton up what they called the North River back then to Albany. Never made it in time to prevent Burgoyne's surrender. So Lee's plan was simple. Some historians have said that Howe did follow his plan by going to Philadelphia. I don't believe that that's the case. I think that the record will show in my work that Howe was predisposed to doing that anyway. I also don't believe that Howe took Lee's plan all that seriously. Certainly didn't execute the other parts of that activity. So my research questions are going to be: was Charles Lee a traitor? And if he, why did he write this plan? What was his motivations? Some people have postulated that he did this to avoid hanging as a traitor to the crown. Others said he thought he did this to improve his confinement conditions, which at first were rather harsh. And then Lee intimates this, as well as others intimate this, is that he did this to trick Howe into adopting a losing strategy. I also think that that's a little bit far-fetched. But, and then did he have a change of heart? And did he really want to, did he really believe that the British were the only people that could win, and so he wanted to be on the winning side? Another question around this is if he's a traitor, why did he stop with the plan? Why didn't he change sides like Benedict Arnold? If he truly had a change of heart, why didn't he rejoin the British cause? His plan here is on the left-hand side is a facsimile of that plan. It's held in the New York Public Library. The replica copy, the real copy of that plan, and it came through private hands. It came through Howe's secretaries who kept it after the war and kept it in the family papers. A family named Strakely, and it was discovered in 1858. By a gentleman by the name of George Moore, who was a librarian in the New York Public Library. And what we do know about Charles Lee and the plan is that he did meet privately with William Howe, and that was much of the consternation of the British as much as the Americans, because William Howe was on the same political side in England as Charles Lee. They both were ardent Whigs and against the Tory government of George III. So Whigs were more Republican in nature. They were less monarchical, as well as they were more into the Enlightenment thinking. One question is, why did he actually put this plan in writing? Because it's not all that complicated. I mean, I just described it to you. Possibly Howe made him do it. It's possible. Another possibility is that Lee wanted to reinforce his verbal recommendations, which is probably more likely. And the real question is that why did he do this? It's not really clear. So, further, if he wrote a traitor's plan, why didn't he just change sides? Some believe that Lee just lost his faith in the Americans. And there are some words that possibly to that effect. If he changed sides, he might regain his 11,000-pound British assets that were lost by him becoming a rebel. 11,000 pounds is nothing to sneeze at back then, and would have been more money than he had in the United States at the time. Plus, he'd been closer to his beloved sister. If Lee was close to somebody in his life, it was his sister. So that, he could have certainly have done that. Some of the historians afterwards have thought, well, he didn't change sides because he was basically a soldier of fortune. He would go wherever he thought he could get the most fame. And so he kind of vacillated back and forth between camps because of that. Another historian who wrote the latest, more comprehensive biography of Lee, Philip Pappas, basically said he was a renegade. An earlier historian called him a knight errant of liberty. And so he meant he just kind of had these fog periods that he got out of control. And then lastly, a New Jersey lawyer wrote that in a biography written by Rutgers Press that he basically just was a self-centered guy, did whatever he did at the time because he was self before country. Now, my thesis is that this treasonous plan, historians have made it out to be more than what it was, and that Washington and others knew about this plan, and they didn't really judge this as treasonous. Lee did take a loyalty oath after he came back, and some people have said that he was winking in an eye when he did that, but again, that's, I think, up to subject to question. But I think the real thing about Lee is he challenged Washington, and so people didn't like that. Historians don't like that, and so they made everything Washington did good and everything that Lee did bad. And I think that that's an overstatement. You know, most historians today of the Revolution are very Washington-centric. We know that Washington was a great man. He certainly was a great man. He really helped our cause, and probably no one else could have done what he has done. However, he's not infallible. He was a man. At the time, you didn't know that. We only know that today. And part of the reason for that was that Howe, which is there's a image of him on the left here, which is totally idealized, comes from Europe, and then Washington Circle here in Washington, D.C. We know how this thing worked out. Washington wanted a strategy. He was a nationalist. He wanted a strategy of a national government. He wanted a national army. He wanted to fight the British on conventional terms. He disdained the militia. He disdained the mob. He wanted to have a national government. Lee, on the other side, was a Republican. He was a Whig. He was wary of a standing army. He wanted a small standing army. He liked the militia. He didn't want to recreate a Cromwell. He wanted a strategy of what they called the War of Posts back then. We would call guerrilla war today. He wanted a war that would be run like we would call a guerrilla war. Now, at the end of the day, Washington was in charge, and his point of view prevailed. But it's interesting that if you look at Nathaniel Greene's Southern strategy in the 1780s and 1781, he kind of followed Charles Lee. So Lee may not have been all wrong, and probably wasn't all wrong. So what's his legacy? Just a little bit about the historiography. You know, prior to 1860 and the discovery of this plan, he was viewed as a fervent but pretty eccentric patriot, very eccentric. He was viewed as a highly competent military commander, and he was a folk hero. In fact, there's newspaper articles all the way through Jefferson's 8 years talking about Lee as a folk hero because they didn't like Washington, so they used Lee. Same way the Federalists liked Washington and vilified Lee. After 1860, however, he was viewed by one historian as the arch traitor of the Revolution. But in the last 50 years, there's been more dispassionate views, and I want to build upon these, and there's more recognition for his military contributions. You know, and lastly is that being a traitor back then, you had to understand what's the definition of traitor. Wasn't Washington a traitor? Wasn't all of the Americans really traitors to the British? They were members of the British Empire, and weren't they traitors to that? In that sense, Lee was definitely a traitor. but there was the concept we have of a government today wasn't in place during that. An example of that is the Newburgh conspiracy. This is in 1783. This is after Lee actually died in 1782. And, a group of officers wrote letters and plans basically to not disband the army, to march on Philadelphia, to take over the government because they weren't being paid. And, they weren't being paid for months, and they were supposed to get pensions, and those pensions weren't forthcoming. It looked like Congress was going to disband the army without paying them, and so they had a revolt, and it really took everything Washington could do to calm these people down and to get them back in line without mutiny here, and not using force to attack Congress to get what they thought were their just rewards. So we don't regard them as traitors. And so I think the definition of traitor, we have to be careful of throwing around these emotionally laden terms. Was Lee, did Lee always act consistently? No. And was he trying to hurt the American cause? I actually don't believe so. So his legacy is really in two parts. On the left-hand side, that's his legacy in Europe, and this is a French and a German. There's also a German version of this tintype that was done with showing Lee as being a pretty triumphal general during the Revolution, and actually in Europe he was well respected. And on the right side is the first page of the monograph written by George Moore, which, quote, exposes the treason here. So, it's interesting. What's happened is that on the right side, that has just overshadowed any of his contributions. In fact, many people regard him worse than Benedict Arnold. It's interesting. On the left side, there's a saying underneath there. I'll read it to you because it's in French and German. But it says, only slaves voluntarily surrender to tyranny, but we seek to secure freedom, forcibly breaking the irons that bind us, because our symbol either survives or dies. This actually epitomizes the conundrum of looking backwards at things from our point of view. You notice he used the word slaves here, to tyranny. Well, in actuality, Lee owned 2 slaves. He died with 2 slaves. He willed part of his property that were those slaves to other people. So it's those kind of conundrums are rife back then. And I think that we have to be careful when we evaluate Lee versus Washington, that we don't give Washington a much bigger aura because we know the greatness of his leadership. Because back then they didn't know the greatness of his leadership. Lee saw Washington at its worst. He saw him at the Battle of White Plains leave the high ground exposed, which was an unbelievable mistake. He saw him leave troops at Fort Washington to be massacred by the British. And he saw him firsthand during the French and Indian War that he hadn't learned anything since then when he got holed up at Fort Necessity out in the near the forks of the Ohio. So Lee said, this guy hasn't really learned anything, and I think I got a better plan. So I think that part we need to respect. And because, maybe history has turned Lee to be wrong, and maybe thankfully it's turned him to be wrong. But I think in those shoes, this guy is not just the devil incarnate, and I think that's what is going to be the views of my capstone paper. So with that, I will hope to really look forward to getting together with you, and hope that you enjoyed this, and hope to get some great questions and comments from you during Residency Week. So thank you very much, and see you then.